I remember a while back when we were speaking, you referenced this book they gave you with guidelines for writing LSAT questions. And I'm sure this book is a very closely guarded secret, but I'm wondering if there's anything you remember from it that stood out that you could share.
Uh, it was actually very helpful. They gave, they broke, presumably they had one for each of the three item types. I only got one for logical reasoning and analytical reasoning. But not only would they give exemplars of good items, but they also gave examples of common mistakes to make. Um, I think that was the first time I really became attuned to some of the differences between subtypes of items. So, for instance, necessary and sufficient assumptions. I don't think I was really that sensitive to the distinction until I looked at the item writing guidelines. Another thing that struck me is how what counts as an inference in logical reasoning is different from what counts as an inference in reading comp. In logical reasoning, when they talk about inferences, they almost always have in mind the strict logical notion of an inference, implication. Whereas in reading comp, it's much more like a psychological notion. So somebody who says this probably has this, what other idea bouncing around in their head. And that getting used to that distinction took a little while too.
Oh wow, that's a really interesting point. So maybe it's a bit more looser and a bit more reading between the lines when it comes to reading comp, would you say?
Absolutely. So when I talk about this to students, invariably somebody has some food or a drink on their table or whatever, and we'll have just covered logical reasoning assumptions, which are, for all intents and purposes, missing premises of one type or another. And then I'll walk around the classroom and say, "Hey, you done with those fries or whatever?" And they'll say, "You want some?" And I said, "What can you assume?" "Oh, you can assume from the question that I want your fries or whatever." It's not an argument. There's no missing premise. It's just based on what I said, what other idea was probably bouncing around in my head. And that's the way to think about these kinds of inferences in reading comp, I think.